20 minutes sounds like a lot of time, but when it comes to breaks, it's a really short time. So I'm sorry, but we have to get going with the third part of the seminar. So in the first two parts, we have heard about the scale and the scope of the diet and nutrition-related challenges and some examples of what can be done. And in this section, we will now move into the world of human rights and to try to answer the question of this seminar: can the human rights-based approach accelerate reduction of undernutrition and obesity? And to be able to answer that, we need to know a bit more about human rights and what is the link with diet and health and nutrition. So I'm very happy to welcome our first speaker in this section, who's Asbjørn Eide. He is Emeritus Professor at the Norwegian Center for Human Rights, the Faculty of Law at the University of Oslo. And he will tell about adequate food and diet-related health as international legal human rights. What do the international human rights system tell us about the right to food and the right to health?
Thank you very much. I will talk about food and health in human rights. But let me first explain that human rights are now seen generally as the agreed constitutional framework for social contracts. And by social contract, I mean that which holds a society together in modern states. So let's, and I then want to outline three basic aspects of human rights. They can be lumped in three categories: freedoms, participation, and claim rights. By freedoms, I refer to freedom from torture, freedom from slavery, freedom of movement, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of association, and of assembly. Generally, freedom to do what is not prohibited by prior law. And by prior law, I refer to a law that existed before something has been done for which somebody might want to criminalize somebody for it. So it has to be a prior law. And overall, a general respect for the rule of law. Participation involves political rights, access to information, transparency of law, and governance. And the claim rights deal with, these are claims on the state and society. These are the social and economic rights: right to work, right to social security, right to an adequate standard of living, including food and housing, right to education, and right to health. These rights require positive action by the state, and somehow the society as a whole has to contribute to it. State obligations under human rights are now generally recognized to consist of three elements. But it applies to those states that have ratified human rights conventions, and they are required to respect and to ensure the human rights which are contained in the conventions they have ratified. And nearly all states of the world have ratified at least some of these conventions. And there are a threefold level of state obligations. Firstly, to respect human freedoms. Secondly, to protect these freedoms against others that may cause harm to that. And then thirdly, to fulfill the rights when required, either by way of facilitation, such as giving advice on healthy diets, or proper food labeling, to give some examples, or by regulations backed by some kind of sanctions, such as protecting us against unethical marketing of unhealthy foods, which we have heard about here today, and sometimes by direct provision, such as free health care institutions, free education, social security, and food programs of various kinds. Human rights are increasingly monitored by the so-called treaty bodies. These treaty bodies, they are bodies that have been set up by the United Nations and also by regional bodies. What is particularly important for us is the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. You will hear more about that later. These treaty bodies evaluate state performance based on periodic state reports. The states are obliged to present reports on how they have implemented the rights that are set out in the conventions. And these treaty bodies can also make use of other information, for instance, by so-called shadow reports from civil society organizations. And all of this results in a consolidated practice over time by these treaty bodies. Treaty bodies pursue a dialogue with state representatives and make the so-called concluding observations on the improvements the states should take, improvements should be made within the next time they report back to the body. And they adopt also what they call general comments on selected rights in the conventions, expressing treaty bodies' interpretation of each of the rights that are set out, and recommend further enhancement by the governments of the realization of that particular right. In this seminar, we are particularly focusing on the right to adequate food. I emphasize adequate food, not only enough food, but also adequate food, and on the right to health. This is what is the core of attention at this seminar. So the right to adequate food is set out in the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in its Article 11, and it has been elaborated in the General Comment number 12 on the right to adequate food, pointing out that adequate food does not only prevent malnutrition in all forms, but there is a double duty ensuring everyone's fundamental right to be free from hunger and to ensure to everyone, as far as possible, adequate food and healthy diets while recognizing the freedom of the individual to make their own choices. The right to health is set out in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Article 12, which says that everyone has the right to the highest attainable standard of health. And this has been elaborated in a General Comment number 14 of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which deals in part with healthcare coverage, but also with various kinds of public health that has to be progressively realized. It has to address health in all policies. It can be done through fiscal and other regulations, and it can be done through various forms of promotion of healthy diets. Children's rights are set out in the Convention on the Rights of the Child in Article 24, including requirements concerning nutrition, and it has been further addressed in the Committee on the Rights of the Child, General Comments number 15 and 16, and you will hear more about that from the next speaker. It's important to recognize that these international human rights are all interrelated. The right to food and the right to health are not isolated rights. They depend on the realization of many other rights to be sustainably realized, including civil and political rights. So there are many opportunities, but there are also challenges for nutrition to elaborate these linkages. Follow further, and that is what I hope will be an outcome of this seminar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Asbjørn, for elaborating on the human rights system and showing that actually food and health are legal human rights in countries that have ratified the relevant human rights conventions and covenants. This is maybe a bit difficult foreign language to those of you who are not familiar to the human rights framework, but just stay focused and in tune, and you will hear more about it. And now we'll hear from Katarina Okatuar from the Welmar Research Group, Faculty of Law, University of Copenhagen, who will tell us more about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it's relevant for malnutrition, so please.
Thank you so much. So my basic point that I would like to talk about is that children have rights, and as a result, states have obligations. I'm not really going to talk about food companies, unfortunately, I don't have time, is the basic explanation. So I'm going to focus on states and in particular accountability. So Asbjørn has already introduced some of the rights that children and all people have. But I'm going to focus on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the reason why the convention is interesting is because, first of all, here we combine what Asbjørn has talked about, civil and political rights and socioeconomic rights. These rights are all found in the Convention on the Rights of the Child in one document. And also we have important legal principles, such as the principle of the best interests of the child and also of child participation. And as I said, these rights place obligations on states. But as we've also seen, the texts are quite flexible or quite open-ended. So they really require concretizing for us to understand, or for states to understand, what is required of them. And one means of doing this, or the means actually of doing this, is through accountability. So we've already heard some examples of actions that, for instance, the Norwegian government or other states have taken. But we can't just stop by saying we've done something. And that's really important here. We can't think that states have done enough by taking some sort of action, because there needs to be some accountability to measure whether this is effective, whether it is meeting their obligations. Just doing something is really not enough. Okay, so in order to discuss accountability, we have to question who is accountable. And normally, under international law, our focus is on the state, because the state enters into this treaty, or as Asbjørn has sort of described as, this contract. The contract is between your state and all the other states. There's also questions, especially in this conversation, on the obligations of other actors. And here in particular, you're probably used to hearing a lot in the media about the responsibilities of parents. And I want you to bear this in mind, and we'll come back to this at the end. But I want to emphasize that the primary responsibility here under human rights is on the state to take action to assist children and to assist parents in realizing these rights. Okay, so I want to introduce some different types of accountability. This might look a bit frightening for the non-lawyers, but it's really just an idea, and there's a lot of different understandings of accountability. So I'm going to start off with something that is accessible to everyone, I think. And that I describe as moral accountability. Or you could also describe it as maybe political accountability. So this isn't legal. It's more what I would say peer pressure. So here we have the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and we can see that every state in the world has ratified this convention. That means they have bound themselves to respect and ensure the rights in the convention. Almost, because one state has not, the United States, but let's not worry about them right now. And this means that the convention can be described as an international legal and moral titan, because we have such widespread agreements that children are entitled, children have these rights, children are rights holders. And this can be used, and those of you who are from civil society organizations, or also students and interested in this area, this can be used to pressure your government. Your government has signed up to these legal rights and obligations. Moving on, as a lawyer, we want to go towards the more legal accountability. So let's consider what I call here quasi-legal, or you could also call them soft law instruments. Asbjørn has very helpfully already introduced them, but here let's look at them in terms of a right to nutrition. So here is one example. So this is a general comment, the Committee on the Rights of the Child general comment on the right to health. And here is the Committee on the Rights of the Child laying out all states' obligations under the convention. And here they are calling on states to ensure access to nutritionally adequate, culturally appropriate and safe food. And then there's also an example about school feeding. Now these general comments can still be criticized, as I and others here have done, for their lack of concreteness and for their lack of how do we ensure this, okay? Because, as I said, it's a quasi-legal. So the Committee on the Rights of the Child, it's not a court. It can't force your government to comply. That's where civil society and all of us as citizens come in. We also have the concluding observations, and these are specific observations or recommendations that the committee will give to your state. So here is quite a detailed one, where the state gives recommendations to a particular nation. And it is telling them what they should do. And this is based on information they have gathered from different places, including from civil society organizations who will be based in this country and will submit this information. So this is where you can play a role by providing the committees with this information and pressuring them to pressure governments. We also have the Universal Periodic Review. I'm cheating a bit by mentioning this because it's not directly under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but it is another important quasi-legal accountability measure which can be used to make recommendations, where states make recommendations to other states about the rights found in conventions, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Here's one to Norway, and this comes from Algeria. And it has told Norway to intensify its solidarity efforts for the rights to food and education in countries that cannot afford to ensure this due to lack of financial resources. So Algeria is calling on Norway to assist lower income countries. So maybe the people from the Norwegian government present will be inspired. But we also have other maybe more interesting accountability measures. And I'm just introducing this, and maybe we can come back to it at some other point. We now, with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we have an optional protocol on communications. So this means that individuals and also groups representing individuals can bring a complaint or a communication to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, claiming that the country has violated rights, including the right to health and the right to food. It's not bulletproof. There are limitations. I'm not going to go through them here because I'll scare you away. But what I will mention is the problem is that this has not been universally ratified. So this protocol also needs to be ratified, and many countries have not, including Norway. So again, Norwegian government. But I'm happy to say that Denmark here is unusually ahead of the other Scandinavian countries and has actually ratified this. So what could a complaint look like in this field? That's something that we could consider moving forward. Moving on, we could also consider another form of accountability, which is legalized. And this might be interesting to some of you. And this is where parties in a dispute, in a legal dispute, refer to the rights in the convention. So here we have the European Court of Human Rights. The case is not on point, but here we have the actors in the case, and they are drawing on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, including the right to health, to build their arguments. It's not being used by the court to make a decision in the case, and this is also a point I need to mention, because the right to health and the right to food are not directly protected by the European Convention on Human Rights. Finally, where I suppose as lawyers we want to get to is legal accountability. And this is where the convention or children's rights generally are used in deciding legal disputes. So I have a very nice example, and this is a Brazilian case on food marketing to children. And here the court, in its decision, makes it what I think is a very interesting statement, which I don't have time to read, which is about autonomy. And as I said before, there's a lot of argument that if the state intervenes, that they are disrupting the relationship between the parents and the family. Here the court says no. It says that actually it is the food companies that are disrupting this relationship between the parents and the family. And actually, regulating here is protecting autonomy. It's not paternalism. It is actually protecting children and parents' autonomy to make decisions without interference from the food industry. And the court ends, or I end, with this call for activism from the court. And it says, here it says, the Superior Court of Justice needs to tell not only Paduku, one of the people in the case, but the whole food industry that enough, no more. The argument that there was no risk to health and safety, which is not the only criterion of the Consumer Protection Law. Where is the child's autonomy of will? Thank you very much. This research was part of a project that I was part of called Governing Obesity, and it's also part of my PhD thesis and some research that I've done with two of my colleagues who are not here yet, Professor Mette Hartley and also Celine Braza-Wilson. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katarina. And it makes a nice bridge over to what Bård Anders will talk about. And we have also heard earlier about the commercial determinants of malnutrition. And Peter mentioned land grabbing. And we have heard that the states have legal responsibilities and have obligations with respect to human rights. But what responsibilities do businesses have? Bård Anders Andreassen is a professor at the Norwegian Center for Human Rights at the University of Oslo, and he will tell us about the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, obligations of states to protect, obligation of state, and responsibilities of businesses to respect human rights.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. When we talk about a human rights approach to solve issues, solve problems, malnutrition, poverty, we obviously have to introduce law. And that is what we are doing in a few interventions now. We need to talk about law, but what is law? Can law actually play a role in eradicating poverty and malnutrition? Or is it just a fantasy? I believe it can in certain cases, but we should be cautious about the force of law, because there are so many preconditions when we talk about legal approaches to eradicating poverty. But there are examples, not least from India, that the Supreme Court has made decisions on the right to food and enforced political authorities to change their policy in order to solve malnutrition or at least food problems. So that is just a starting point. When we talk about law, we also, as we have heard, we talk about soft law and hard law. Hard law is the law that is applicable in courts and is being pursued by courts. Soft law is basically regulations and guidances from a legal perspective that states should act on the basis of, and increasingly also not other actors than states. They should act on guidelines, for instance, to regulate market, as Kaya was talking about, to regulate modern food systems that Nana was talking about. So it is a matter of regulation and to give guidance on that regulation. Not always legally enforceable, but there are other forces in the market, when we turn to that, which are important, that can force actors, businesses, companies to act. And that is one mechanism that we talk about in the human rights field very often, is shaming and blaming, and the reputational loss that companies are feeling. That is often a more important mechanism of changing behavior than legal regulation and legal enforcement in this field. But the one does not exclude the other. This picture that you see here is from Bhopal, one of the biggest cities in India. And much of the debate about business responsibility for their acts stems from, for instance, not least, this accident which was in 1984 in December. And it was about a huge explosion in a factory called Union Carbide, which was producing pesticides. And that explosion led to enormous emissions of poisonous gas in the environment. And the environment was basically poor environment, people living in poverty, slums, as we call them, informal settlements. And immediately 3,700 people died out of poisoning in the night while they were asleep in the huts. A few days after, 8,000 more people died. It's estimated that at least 50,000 people were disabled because of this poisoning, and more than 500,000 has had health and other insurance as an effect of this poisoning. Now this inspired a kind of a debate about the responsibility of businesses for this. And the business would say, as usual, this is not our responsibility, it's the state's responsibility to compensate people and to assist them. While the debate emerged that companies have an independent responsibility in such issues. There were court cases. They tried to bring it to the United States where the mother company existed. The United States court said, go back to India. This happened in India. Go to the courts of India. And the Indian courts were not able to act. Some court systems are not strong enough, and they were not willing to do it. People didn't get compensation. Very little happened, although a few sentences were issued after 10 years. Now this is, in a sense, the background for talking about a human rights-based approach to malnutrition, to obesity, and to poverty eradication. Usually we have had in the human rights system what we call a state-centric approach. And it goes back to the Westphalian system of thinking. Westphalia, you know, the Peace of Westphalia, the wars of Europe ended up in principles supporting the state sovereignty. And that has inspired much of legal thinking since then, 1648, as you will remember. And it also inspired the developments which took place in the making of human rights since 1948. It was the state's obligations, as Asbjørn pointed out, to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And little mention was made of other actors in that system. So it was state-centric. Now, over the years, it has new changes have, or new developments certainly have occurred, not least in our time of globalization and the growth of multinational companies, which has made this state focus too limited. And a debate has emerged, particularly in the 1990s, which was the heyday of human rights thinking and also of current era of globalization, very rapid changes, growth of multinational companies, that this debate emerged. Now there is a reference in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 in the preface or in the preamble that refers to other organs of society. The state has a duty, yes, but there are also other organs of societies that should be taking rights seriously. They didn't specify what that was, but in the 1990s, when this debate in human rights law emerged, that was used as an important entry point for defining the role and the responsibilities of non-state actors, as they are called in the human rights system, that is businesses, but also non-governmental organizations, but we are talking about businesses here. So from the 1990s, there was a reorientation in the debate. The orthodoxy was replaced with a new and less state-centric model of human rights obligations. I couldn't go into details on all this development. There were many drivers of this development. I would point out particularly one driver, Kofi Annan, who was the General Secretary of the United Nations in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And he was very much involved in developing what we call the Global Compact Global Compact in the United Nations. A Global Compact is an involuntary reporting system that international companies can register on and register their behavior in important social issues, environmental concern, equality, gender equality, and a number of other issues. Human rights were also added to that list after a while. Now, there was attempts in the early 2000s to develop a draft or to develop a legal document, a convention as we call it, on human rights and businesses, which was not successful, but it was replaced with the appointment of this man, John Gerard Ruggie, a Canadian professor at Harvard, a political scientist, who was appointed by Kofi Annan to develop some new instruments, as we call them, some new mechanisms for making human rights, for businesses responsible for human rights. And it ended up in 2011, after 5 years of global consultations that Ruggie held with companies, with governments, with academics, with non-governmental organizations, civil society around the world, ended up in a set of 30 guidelines that he presented to the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is the highest body of human rights in the UN. And they adopted these guidelines anonymously as guidelines for the 1 minute, my God, for business behavior. It consists of 3 pillars. In the academic community, we are happy with pillars. And these pillars is saying that the state has a duty to protect human rights. Businesses have a duty to respect human rights. And businesses and states have a shared duty to compensate victims of human rights violations by companies. So there is a shared responsibility for what we call effective remedy, which is another word for making compensation if things go wrong. The state duty to protect consists of a state duty to regulate business behavior. It consists of making policies. And in this system, there has been a slow growth in developing state policies, national policies in this field. There is a state duty to investigate when things go wrong, and there is a state duty to enforce human rights. Enforce human rights would then also mean enforce human rights towards businesses when they do wrongs. One example of that is Nestlé and the breast milk scandal in Switzerland, in Nestlé, a number of years back, which could be an illustration. If the state is not protecting, it breaches its human rights duties. The second pillar, I'm still in 1 minute, half minute. The second pillar is the company pillar, and it talks about the company's corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And it says that companies should introduce what we call due diligence, which is a way of talking about risk analysis for the behavior. So they should map out and try to understand what the impact of the behavior can be on human rights. And they should address the negative impacts and try to avoid them. And they should perform due diligence throughout their businesses. And the last pillar is about the compensation, which could be both legal and non-legal. It could be state-based or it could be independent arbitration between victims or a community which is victimized by a company behavior. For instance, the Formosa fish scandal in Vietnam quite recently. And it should be kind of effective. Lastly, there are limitations to all this. I don't want to go into all of that, but it is certainly the self-regulation and self-monitoring of companies have its limitations. And it is also important, as we are talking about the food industry, to talk about regulations inside sectors of businesses. And certainly, this is important of the engagement that the last speaker was talking about. Activism, the role of stakeholders is certainly important in this. Civil society engagement is quite essential because the legal framework is still quite fragile. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bård Anders. I'm sorry for the rush. We are already a bit delayed, so there will not be time for clarifications. We have to go straight to Amandine. But there will be, I can say that there will be a short 3 minutes break between the last speaker here and the panel debate, because it's a bit too long to just sit for many hours. So you will have a chance then, and then you will have the chance to ask questions during the panel debate. Okay, so now I'm very happy to introduce Amandine Gauds, who's head of the Law and Non-Communicable Diseases Research Unit at the University of Liverpool, who will tell us about what obligations the state have to protect public health in the case of childhood obesity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking Wenche and colleagues for their invitation. I've been looking forward to this event for quite a long time, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you. There is a growing momentum in a range of policy documents identifying the need to adopt a children's rights approach or a human rights approach to obesity and non-communicable diseases prevention. And this momentum started largely with the adoption of the WHO Global Action Plan for the prevention and control of NCDs in 2013, which makes human rights one of its key principles, but more obviously, even in the final report of the WHO Commission on Ending Childhood Obesity, which in its 2016 report called on government and society's moral responsibility to protect children from the risk associated with obesity, but also referred explicitly to the obligations assumed by state parties to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and identified elsewhere in the document the imperative for states to protect the right of a child to health. Katrina has briefly mentioned Article 24 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which lays down the obligations for state parties to recognize the right of a child to the enjoyment of a highest attainable standard of health, and in particular to pursue the full implementation of this right by taking a range of measures, including combating disease and malnutrition through, among others, the provision of adequate nutritious foods and clean drinking water. And again, as Björn identified, the importance of adequate food, so not only enough food, but nutritiously adequate food. Katrina and as Björn explained that this right was slowly being fleshed out by various human rights bodies, and in particular the Committee on the Rights of the Child delivered a general comment calling for state action to ensure the rights of a child to health, and it interpreted this right as an inclusive right which required, among other things, that states address the underlying determinants of health, so nutrition and the prevention of obesity. But as the first panel, and Annelien in particular, explained, obesity is a multifactorial, very complex societal problem which requires that a range of multi-sectoral coordinated action be taken through the life course, etc., etc. And this is another mapping of the complexity of this problem. That's the Foresight map of 2007. So the question is, even though we see increasing references in the Committee on the Rights of the Child country report to obesity and the need for states to tackle these causal determinants of obesity, including food marketing, these need to be fleshed out, and that was the key question that Katrina was asking. I'm focusing to give you an idea on the marketing of unhealthy food to children, nutritiously poor food, but a lot of what I'm saying could be applied to other areas relevant to obesity prevention and malnutrition more broadly. And the argument that I'm making, that some others have made, is that you need to read these rights, these convention rights, in light of the technical guidance which is evidence-based that the WHO and other competent agencies and bodies have adopted. So even though the WHO recommendations on food marketing are not legally binding, because they are evidence-based, they need to inform how we understand Article 24 and other related convention rights to ensure that these rights are sufficiently fleshed out and that states can indeed be held accountable for their failure to implement the recommendations, and again, a point Katrina made, to implement the recommendations effectively. It's not enough to say in the tick boxing exercise, have you taken measures to regulate food marketing to children? Oh yeah, we've restricted vending machines in school and have done nothing else. Yes, we have. We need to go much further, and this is where the accountability mechanism that Katrina was discussing is particularly relevant. So the WHO recommendations were adopted in May 2010 unanimously by the then 193 countries that made up the World Health Assembly. Again, their recommendations, they could be seen as technical guidance. There is this moral responsibility of states to implement because they've committed to them. The argument is that the responsibility is not even only moral, it is far more forceful than this in light of the fact that the recommendations inform the convention rights, Article 24, and other relevant human rights provision. And some flesh was put on the bones of the recommendations by the Framework Implementation Report of 2012. I will say that this report was not endorsed as the recommendations were by the World Health Assembly, but nonetheless they provide some food for thought as to how to regulate food marketing to children. And more, even though the WHO recommendations do not mention children's rights, it is very strongly arguable that their implementation promote a children's rights approach. And again, we've done some work for UNICEF, forthcoming publication later this year, showing how unhealthy food marketing impacts a whole range of rights. We've talked about the right to health and the right to food, but we could also talk about the right to privacy, especially in the digital environment Mimi is going to talk about, and many other rights as listed on this slide. So the recommendation, importantly, have as their primary objective the reduction of the overall impact of unhealthy food marketing on children and therefore their rights. And the recommendations call for recognize the importance of tackling two components of food marketing. Exposure on the one hand, which refers to the reach of food marketing, what kind of media, how much are children exposed to unhealthy food marketing, but also power. What kind of techniques are particularly effective to promote unhealthy food to children? And you will be familiar with some of them: the use of celebrities, the use of cartoon characters through licensed agreement, whereby here the Nemo example, Walt Disney would contract with McDonald's, or the use of equity brand characters, where a brand itself develops some specific characters that are appealing to children and use them to promote their food. The other point, which again is particularly important to ensure that the regulation of food marketing to children is effective, is that states must recognize the greater potential of a comprehensive approach. So it's not enough to regulate broadcasting media if we know that more and more the internet is the primary media used by children, certainly the case in the UK, and where you may witness some investment shifts, where once a program is regulated, say a children's program like Scooby-Doo here, but you leave family viewing programs unregulated, you can be sure that the advertising is going to shift from the regulated to the unregulated program. And just to give you a figure which is particularly telling in the UK, is that 70% of the TV children watched, at least in 2010, would not fall within the definition of a child's program. So it leaves quite a lot of program unregulated to which children are indeed exposed. But also you will see a shift in investment from regulated media to unregulated media, from regulated setting to unregulated setting. Here, this is a motorway stop on the Belgian motorway. Schools are regulated, but the WHO recommendations require that settings where children gather should be free of all forms of food marketing. So this place may have been for my daughter's parents, but I doubt it. And the problem as well is that very often in the definition of marketing in member states, display at points of sale fall outside this definition of marketing, whereas the recommendations take a much broader approach which relate to any form of promotion to children. And of course, from regulated to unregulated techniques. So if you regulate license agreement, but you don't regulate equity brand characters, then the brands will continue to develop these characters until Chile comes in and bans the use of Frosties and similar characters on breakfast cereal. And finally, there's the question of sponsorship. Again, sponsorship, the argument of the food industry is to say, you are not promoting through sponsorship a specific product, which is unhealthy, or a service. You're promoting a brand. And in our brand, we have a range of items. Some of them will be healthy, some will not be so healthy. But nevertheless, if you ask the public whether they see Pepsi as a healthy brand, I suspect they may not think that it is, and there have been calls from the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health to ban sponsorship by brands that do promote unhealthy food, particularly at children's sports events. So I will conclude with this slide, and well, two slides. If I may have 1 minute, and I'm concluding, I'm really concluding. Here, what we see from Alan Grover, and this is one of the most powerful statements that would avoid the fragmentation between this WHO approach and this UN human rights approach. Here we're trying to bring the two together by arguing that states have a positive duty to regulate unhealthy food advertising and the promotion strategy of food companies. And the argument we've made on several occasions is that fundamental rights should not only be used as a shield. You get out your right to health when you're attacked by companies that argue that they have a right to free expression and to property, but as a shield to actually regulate this industry and their commercial practices used. Sorry, I was slightly over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We now start to understand that human rights does have a lot to do with health and nutrition and related challenges. I'm very happy to introduce Tulika Bansal, who will share experiences from work with businesses to respect human rights in food marketing activities related to children. Tulika is from the Human Rights and Business, from Danish Institute of Human Rights, and working with human rights and business. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Tulika Bansal. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our work working with businesses, including businesses working in the food and beverage sector. So as you can see here, we work with a range of companies worldwide, including with some food and beverage companies, including Nestle, Arla, and in the past we also worked with Coca-Cola. Maybe a little bit of background, the Danish Institute for Human Rights is Denmark's National Human Rights Commission. So we have the mandate to promote and protect human rights in Denmark, but we have a wider mandate to also do this globally. And in addition to working with governments and civil society and academia, we also have the mandate to work directly with companies. So in my department, the Human Rights and Business Department, we work with governments to help them implement respect for promoting and protecting human rights, but we also work directly with companies who need support with respecting human rights. I've been working for a number of years, for example, with Nestle on this issue. And so we work with all these different companies, helping them in, for example, developing policies on different human rights issues, conducting impact assessments, so going on the ground and actually looking at what the impacts are, reporting on human rights issues, and developing tools for businesses. So Professor Andreasen, he already talked a little bit about the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. I wanted to go a little bit deeper into this by saying that businesses have the responsibility to respect human rights under this framework. And what they have to do is to avoid infringing the human rights of others in their own operations, but also in their supply chains. So it could be that a business partner of a company is doing something, and then it's also the responsibility of the company to address this. And companies should do this by knowing and showing where the human rights impact is. So knowing is first to understand what your impacts are, and that can be through a mapping. It could be through understanding what the situation on the ground is by, for example, going into a factory or going into a pipeline. But for the food and beverage sector, and especially the topic that we're talking about now, marketing to children, this is something that's remained a bit untouched. How, as a company, do you assess how you're affecting children through your marketing practices? Do you do surveys with parents, with children? Do you visit schools to see how they are impacting children? Do you visit sports events? And that type of work has not really been done yet. So, a few examples of work that we have done in the food and beverage sector and in relation to marketing and marketing to children. So one of the companies that we work with is Nestle. And one of the things that we've done is conducting human rights impact assessment in 12 countries. And within the scope of these assessments has also been their marketing practices of infant formula. So in the countries that we've been to, we have looked at how they have marketed infant formula and also what external stakeholders say about these issues. So in those countries, we have spoken to, for example, the World Health Organization offices or NGOs that work on these issues, because those are the organizations that know what's happening on the ground and whether companies like Nestle or other companies are actually respecting the World Health Assembly recommendations and other obligations that they have. Another project that we have done is with the Danish dairy company Arla, and this doesn't relate directly to marketing to children, but I thought it's still a good example to share. It's, we developed a methodology for them to conduct a human rights assessment when they entered a new country. So in this case, they entered Senegal, And before starting their operations, their market entry to sell dairy products, they looked at how the distribution and marketing of their products could affect, for example, the right to food and the right to an adequate standard of living, which I thought is a good example, because this is not something that a lot of food and beverage companies do, that they look at the impacts of their product to, let's say, dairy farmers in the country. Another piece of work that we have done is in Myanmar, together with a center that we established called the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business. With the country opening up, a lot of companies are entering the country, including a lot of food and beverage companies. So all the Pepsis, Coca-Colas, and Nestle's of the world now have a really huge presence in the country, and the obesity rates are increasing. And we wrote a paper on children's rights and business in Myanmar, which looks at the 10 children's rights and business principles, including one of the principles, principle number 6, that looks at marketing and advertising to children. And here we have given examples of what is happening in Myanmar in terms of marketing of infant formula, but also marketing of unhealthy foods. In the context of Myanmar, companies are marketing foods in schools. They are actually selling unhealthy packaged foods in schools, and the obesity rate is increasing. And then we have given recommendations what companies in Myanmar should do on the issue. And the last example is a tool that we have developed, which is the Human Rights Compliance Assessment Tool, which is a tool for businesses on all human rights issues that are relevant for them. And one of the sections that is pictured here is the Product Quality and Marketing Practices supplement. And this talks about, it has questions and indicators for businesses to assess whether they have the right policies and procedures in place in terms of marketing. So these are a few examples, but it shows that in our work with food and beverage companies, marketing to children is not the highest issue on the agenda. And that leads me to the next slide, which is around challenges. So what you see here, these are all the rights that we have. And the ones pointed out with the yellow arrows, I don't know if the people in the back can see them, but they're the right to life, rights of protection of the child, the right to health, the right to privacy. These are not necessarily the rights areas that are highest on the agenda for the food and beverage sector. Food and beverage companies, but also other companies, look more at traditional human rights. So for example, labor rights issues, community impacts, security issues when you talk about oil and gas companies, but issues related to marketing, advertising, are often not considered salient human rights issues, or the issues that have the highest risk of negatively impacting people. And to give you an example, an organization called SHIFT, which was established by some of the authors of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, has developed a reporting framework for companies on how they're implementing the UN Guiding Principles. And of the around 12 food and beverage companies that have submitted a report and have identified what they consider the most salient human rights issues, so the most important human rights issues for them that they consider that have the most negative impact on human beings, only one company mentioned responsible marketing, and that was a Mexican company. So none of the other companies, including Coca-Cola, Nestle, others mentioned marketing as their salient human rights issue. Other challenges include, for example, the fact that some of the largest food and beverage companies are based in the global south, where the regulation on marketing to children is much more limited, and these companies are also less in the limelight. So can think of large food and beverage companies in countries like India, Mexico, Brazil, China. We don't hear that much about those companies. Another challenge is what I'm sure Mimi will talk about, is the shift from traditional human rights issues to using of other marketing techniques and the human rights issues that come with that. So for example, by using social media, it's you get the right to privacy and right to information. But to talk about challenges, I can go on for long. I wanted to conclude with some opportunities and ideas for next steps. So one of the, I think, entry points we can think about is the Children's Rights and Business Principles that were developed by UNICEF, UN Global Compact, and Save the Children. One of the principles is really on marketing and advertising to children. And even though this is soft law, the principles really very well explain what the issue is. And because it's about children's rights, sometimes companies are more open to bring on that discussion rather than opening the box of human rights that's much broader. Then another option is using the Sustainable Development Goals and, of course, goal number 2 as an entry point. Companies are more and more looking at the SDGs and trying to use that as an opportunity to talk about what good they're doing. But it's important to note that the SDGs are grounded in human rights. 92% of the goals and indicators are grounded in international human rights law. So there's an opportunity to bring those two agendas together and push companies to not only cherry pick the goals that they want to use, but for example, for the food and beverage company to look at goal 2 and see what are you doing on marketing. And then I think that the last point is around sector collaboration. So we have done something called sector-wide impact assessments, where you look at a whole sector and their negative human rights impacts. I think there's an opportunity to look at the food and beverage sector and look at issues around marketing. Rather than looking at one company, look at it industry-wide and, for example, collaborate with industry associations like the Consumer Goods Forum. Well, that's it.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. Yeah, thanks. We will now quickly move on to Mimi Tatlow-Golden from Faculty of Wellbeing, Education and Language Studies in the UK, Marketing and Healthy Foods to Children in the Digital Age, Challenges Presented by Intersecting Human Rights. So you will clearly go on the same topic and share your experiences with that.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. And as you're going to see, I'm going to pick up on a lot of themes that have already been established in the last couple of hours. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is articulated to some degree in these 2 reports, one of them with WHO, with all of those colleagues who are listed there, and the other one who's feeding the kids online for the Irish Heart Foundation while I was based in Dublin just before I moved to the UK a couple of years ago. So you just Google those titles, they come up, and you can access the PDFs if you're interested in finding out more about this work. What I'm going to talk about is what I call these economies of emotion, engagement, and entertainment that are created in digital media. In which, and a lot of the examples here focus on Facebook because some of the initial data that's coming through is on Facebook, but the principles still apply similarly on platforms like Instagram and elsewhere that younger people are more likely to be on, I should say. And so we're looking at companies engaging children and young people very closely on social media, looking to bring them into a network, engage with them, make everything fun and enjoyable. And I can tell you that if you go on and follow what they're doing in social media, the marketing is brilliant and it's very entertaining and it's very silly and it's funny and it's a little bit provocative, it's a lot of jokes, it's sexual, so it's all of those things that are really appealing to children and young people. Brilliant marketing brains are working to create these kinds of things, and above all to recruit children and young people to be involved in marketing themselves, so they become part of a network who spread the news to their friends. And the research shows clearly that if it's endorsed by your friends, then you're more likely to pay attention to this. So this really is an issue. And our research in Dublin with colleagues at University College Dublin, which is in preparation at the moment, is showing that, as you would predict, young adolescents recall and recognize unhealthy food advertising more than healthy food ads and non-food ads for products that they typically like music and sports gear and so on and so forth. And also critically, they would like and share content more when it features unhealthy marketing. So that tells us that they're more likely to spread it through their networks, and it is, as other qualitative research has told us, bound in with their identities, okay, as adolescents. So bear this all in mind as I talk about what we're looking at here as a sort of broader issue and thinking about the rights perspective of doing something from this. So a lot of these rights have been alluded to already, so I don't need to articulate them at length, but we're looking, I think, in this area at thinking about how we can balance effectively both protection but also, crucially, participation rights that children and young people have. Also, crucially, there's the question of who is defining the best interests. Because there are many different competing interests at play here, including children and young people, and that's something that hasn't really been articulated yet. Now, what I want to do briefly is look under the hood, as they say, and think about how are these digital media actually targeting children and young people. And when I talk about digital media, you can include television and so on and so forth, because increasingly with programmatic advertising and looking at television online, all of these things are coming into a network of what we call surveillance capitalism. And if you think that sounds a little bit exaggerated, it isn't. It's just the world we're living in today. So Shoshana Zuboff coined this phrase. She's a business prof at Harvard and a prof emerita. And she talks about how all of our subjectivities, so our sense of who we are and what we do, are repurposed in order to be commodified. All right? And that just is the world that our young people are growing up in now. And she quotes Google chief economist Hal Varian, who talks about these 4 uses that follow from the computer-mediated transactions which we're engaging in today. And I'm going to look briefly at the 3 that I've highlighted there. So first of all, data extraction and analysis. And as Zuboff says, absolutely nothing that you can imagine is too trivial or ephemeral to be hoovered up and repurposed as a way of profiling, all right? So whatever it is, whatever you do, including the speed at which you type, which can clearly tell people how old you are, they're all gathered together and create and are used to create profiles online. They're called shadow profiles, and those shadow profiles are then used to market goods to us, all right? So we've moved away from a situation where somebody is saying in a shop or on a television screen, hey kids, this is nice to eat, to a scenario where they're saying, I know who you are and I know what you want. And now I'm going to tell you in a way that you find appealing what I think you should buy from me. All right? So we're in different territory here. And we're looking at entire huge networks, really complex networks of taking data, analyzing it, repurposing it, selling it onto people, they sell it onto further people, they link it in with what you buy, they link it in with what you clicked on, who you sent it to, which friends liked it, and gather all that information together to build these profiles. All right? So sitting within that is the food marketing in the digital age. All right? And I think that it's a really interesting test case for this entire range of activity because the right to health is so clearly articulated in terms of children's well-being. And so it seems to me to be a particularly sensitive area. So personalization was the second of those 3 things I said I would talk about. So this Washington Post article from a while ago talks about 98 personal data points that are used to target. It's probably a great deal more than 98 points. All right? So when it says you, well, I sort of insert children there, or your child, and think about how do you feel about that? All right? I think when we think about privacy, there's a sense that, well, I haven't done anything wrong, I'm not engaging in illegal activities, so it really doesn't matter. All right? I think this is something we need to talk about on a much more sort of hard edge and think about what are our privacy rights in a context when people can take information from us under the guise of consent, all right, in the sort of agree and consent process that everybody engages in without reading the terms and conditions, and without the terms and conditions clearly articulating what they're doing with your information either now or in the future, because they reserve the right to change what they do with your data in the future within those terms and conditions. So as far as I'm concerned, for adults, let alone for children, they're complete and utter nonsense. But anyway. All right, so a couple of people have gained access at scale to these social media details and have started doing some research. And these guys are linked in with the big Cambridge Analytica sort of scandal, which you may have heard of. So Michał Kosinski, who's now in California and seems to have sort of escaped a lot of the heat from it, has gained access to a lot of these data and has used it, thank you, to do analyses. And this particular study is very interesting if you're interested in this area. So this was in PNAS in 2017, and you can have a look. In essence, what they did was they took likes, identified personality types from those likes in social media, then created different kinds of ads, targeted them to people based on their personality profiles, and got an uplift in clicks as well as purchase. All right? So that tells us that what people were warning about a while ago is actually effective. And so you can identify the information, you can then specifically target people, and I'm guessing, although we don't have the evidence yet, that this is tapping on vulnerabilities, because we know that there are susceptible effects to media effects, and there are differential effects. And we also know that we're talking about a minority, but a substantial minority of people who are vulnerable to them. All right? Now, my time is running out, so I'm going to whiz through the rest of this. We're looking at a constant experimentation environment. All right? At universities, we have to get ethics to do experiments. That doesn't happen in social media. And they have an extremely tight feedback loop and constantly predicated on what they call eyeballs. So they need us to be looking at their stuff, and that's how they earn their money, and that's why Mark Zuckerberg is a multi-billionaire. All right, and they're designing it to be what they call addictive, with these really tight feedback loops. So if we think about Anand Grover said, he's the special rapporteur on the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, 2013, there's a need for states to adopt laws that prevent companies from using insidious marketing strategies. And to me, this really meets that bar of an insidious marketing strategy. And where are we now? We are in a place, I think, where we're at push and pull of protection and participation, to come back to rights. So in relating to children, we talk about screen time. Headlines tend to say, get the kids off the media, all right? Or regulations like GDPR are saying, use parents to protect children. Neither of those work if you're going to also continue to realize children's participation rights, all right? Because the online world is the world. So we need to think about how are we going to create an online world in which children and young people have participation rights, but are also protected in a way in relation to privacy and health and all those other really important factors. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was really food for thought, very relevant these days. We're going for the last speaker of this session before the panel. And I would like to introduce Serena Pepino from the Right to Food team at the FAO in Rome, who will tell about FAO's work in implementing human rights approach in their work. Thank you.
Can I use this? Wonderful. Good morning, everybody. I want to spend time to thank you all and the organizers for this wonderful opportunity to speak about the FAO work on the implementation of the human right to adequate food through the Right to Food guidelines in the context of national food security and nutrition. So just for you to know a little bit about what FAO does, to set up the context. So FAO is an intergovernmental organization, just like WHO, UNESCO, ILO, and works on a strategic framework that includes 5 strategic objectives. And strategic objective 1 of FAO is about contributing to the eradication of hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition. So let's take a moment here to remember that FAO sees food security and nutrition as the two sides of the same coin. And for me, this is something that it's of particular importance here today. How does FAO aims to achieve this particular objective? Through the promotion of an enabling environment that can ensure food security and nutrition, sharpening sectors' contribution, so not just working with one sector, but on a sort of a multitude of sectors in a cross-sectoral manner that contributes to food security and nutrition through results-oriented action. And we've heard from the previous speakers about the importance of evidence-based action and ensuring real impact at country level. So how the right to food fits within all this? In two manners. First of all, as a human right, which is is part of the constitution of FAO, the only UN organization that has the explicit mandate to protect it and promote it, it underpins the entire strategic framework of the organization. So it just doesn't contribute just to one objective, but to all five. But it contributes directly through specific outputs about legal and policy frameworks and accountability frameworks to this particular objective. We have a team in the FAO, it's called the Right to Food team that I'm part of, and we deliver our work through a non-binding guiding document, which are called the voluntary guidelines to support national efforts and you will read it later, it's a very long title, to shorten it, the Right to Food guidelines. We provide country, regional, and global support to strengthen policy and legal frameworks, apply human rights principles, which I'm going to get to in a second, and enhance the empowerment of rights holders and accountability of duty bearers. And I'm very glad that these two were also touched in previous presentations from my fellow colleagues. So a closer look to the Right to Food guidelines. They are not legally binding. Why do I want to stress this point? It's because the guidelines speak to the commitment of member countries. So like I said earlier, FAO is an intergovernmental organization. We have governing bodies that are made of all countries in the world. There's one thing that they get together to decide and decide that they should take action on. It's a giant, huge step. So when in 2004, these countries, so one of the governing body of FAO, the Council, decided to adopt this document, you have to realize what paramount decision that was. And not just for FAO to implement this document, but for the countries to actually commit to use it at country level. It's a practical tool that offers policy guidance on how to implement right to food related obligations. As we discussed earlier, it's a fundamental human rights, so it has obligations of states, of duty bearers, and it promotes a human rights-based approach to food security and nutrition altogether. And we will look at it in a second. And the last thing about this document that is important is that it promotes policy coherence by looking at 19 different policy areas. So it's not about food security or nutrition, is about everything that connects this human right to all the others that we talked about earlier. They're interrelated, interconnected. Right to social security, right to work. We have policy areas that deal with the management of natural resources, and even international trade and relations. Just before we move to a bit of the practicality of our work, this is, I don't know how many of you have seen this, this is what we call it the food security temple. It just gives you a very quick overview of a typical technical action to promote food security at country level. We acknowledge the need of the people in a certain point in time, and through the 4 pillars of food security, we try to achieve a common goal. What does happen when we have this important mind shift that promotes a food security and nutrition approach through the conception of human rights? The temple becomes a more complex one, but one that has a very remarkable difference. First of all, we stop acknowledging that we have needs. We start talking about human rights. We are entitled to food security and nutrition. We don't need it. We don't have a problem, and hence we find a solution. We work in order for the problem to never arise. And we have human rights principles that are going to guide our actions, not the pillars. And these these principles, participation, accountability, non-discrimination, and so on and so forth, they tell us that we don't just look at a problem in its micro reality. We need to look at the whole governance setting. We need to look at how stakeholders come together. We need to take a look at how the different sectors have a role to play in food security and nutrition, not just the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Health, but all the other government bodies, National Human Rights Commission, civil society organization. They need to come together to talk about how they can come up with a harmonized framework in order to tackle these problems. And this is what FAO tries to do. The guidelines push for that. They tell you food is a matter of rights and not about charity, no? States are duty bearers and individuals are rights holders. So everyone has the right to food, to adequate food. Entitlements are, like I said, our basis for the approach and not needs. And the introduction of claim mechanisms that were previously discussed is key here because they constitute the way that the rights holder can communicate with the duty bearers on violations of human rights, on failure of food security and nutrition programs, and so on and so forth. The focus will be not just on the outcome, but on the process. How do we do things? The human rights principle will guide our actions towards a common goal. And of course, we're not going to look at food security and nutrition in absolute terms. We're going to disaggregate data. We're going to understand and try to understand what the root causes of hunger are. And we're going to focus on the most vulnerable, those that are lacking behind. We're going to try and bring them closer to a common standard. So the Panther principles that I talked about are going to mark our action, and all of that to promote what I talked about earlier, this so-called enabling environment for food security and nutrition. And on this, I just want to stop for a second and really stress the importance of looking at nutrition and food security at the same time. FAO is an organization that tries to at least not discern and separate these two concepts. Thank you. And I really hope that the UN Decade on Nutrition is going to serve as a way to capitalize on the work on human rights that all the UN agencies and other actors in the international communities are taking forward in order to remind us all that the word adequate in the human rights to adequate food means that we need to be mindful of nutritional concerns. So just very quickly, the Right to Food team in FAO. Inside and outside FAO, we try to partner and link the work of national, at the national level to regional efforts in order to have a dialogue that, it's twofold. So regional forum, right, like the Parliamentary Forum for Hunger, they will go back to their national constituencies and make sure to promote what happened at regional level and national level. Corporate efforts within the organization to make sure that a human rights-based approach is used throughout, not just when we work on food security or nutrition, but when we work on land tenure, when we work on water, when we work on small-scale fisheries, and so on and so forth. And of course, let's not forget about efforts in global advocacy, awareness raising, capacity development, and so on and so forth. And this is my last slide, which is about main national level results. It works. I mean, the work that is guided by a human rights-based approach doesn't happen overnight. It takes time and effort, but it does produce meaningful results because it contributes to establishing frameworks, legal policy and accountability frameworks that will stay, they will remain, and will create the premises for duty bearers to fulfill their roles. We have countries that have adopted constitution and policies and laws, a few names on the slide, enhanced capacity and understanding of government and institutions that actually today, especially the procuradorias in Latin America, they are at the forefront of the battle to promote the right to food at country level. Like I said, growing dialogue and participation and partnerships, especially between civil society and government. We have produced a lot of publications and goods, especially when it comes down to customize global goods to national level needs. And finally, contribution to meetings and events such as the Committee on World Food Security and the work of the Special Rapporteur. I won't talk about this slide. This is a very concrete example, which is about Nepal. And I will just say that if anyone is interested in hearing more about it, it's an example that is very dear to me. And I very much welcome you to come to me and talk about it. So thank you very much for the time.